Hey everybody, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and welcome back to our Candid Frame Flickr poll critique. I don't know exactly what to call it, but there's probably a smarter name for it, but it is what it is. But anyway, I just got back from New York recently, and I had a wonderful time there photographing my niece's baptism as well as teaching a small photographic workshop. And the light in New York is phenomenal. I know light is the same everywhere, but there's something about the way the light bounces and is cut off by the buildings, the skyscrapers, the old office buildings, and the way that light is shaped and reflected and transformed. It's unlike any other place in the world that I've been to. But this whole idea of light came to mind, and I wanted to talk about not just light in general, because I think we do that a lot on this channel. One of the things I wanted to do was to talk about how light can affect different elements in the frame. We often consider the light falling on the subject, and usually the light that is falling on the subject is the same as the light falling on the background. But sometimes there can be different things happening with illumination in with respect to the subject and something else going on with the background. And I think those images can sometimes lead to really interesting compositions with a degree of depth that doesn't happen when the light is just uniform. So before we jump into the images, I want to remind you that I'm coming out with a new book, which is called Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. And this is the book which I think should come with every camera, along with the manual, which no one ever reads. But it really sort of gives you the principles that will allow you to make photographs consistently. It's one of the things that I try to do on this channel when I critique the images, is to give you insight and tips as to how to see. And this is what this book is about. It's about seeing, breaking down scenes into light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, and making informed decisions about making good photographs, and being able to do that in a repeatable and consistent fashion. There are a lot of photo books out there that teach you the ins and outs of f-stops and shutter speed, but they don't really give you a context on how to see the world and how that translates to what the camera's doing. This book is my solution for that. So if you want to check it out and you want to buy it, go to the Rocky Nook website. There'll be a link below in the notes, and make sure to use the offer code Porello40, and you'll get 40% off the list price, which is a great deal for a 300 plus page book. So, and if you like what you read in the book, please write a review in the Amazon store, even if you don't buy it directly from Amazon, because it goes a long way to help me market the book. But that being said, let's jump into the images. All right, our first shot is by Linda Mcclain. No XF data on this image. Now, it's the lighting that immediately arrests my attention in this shot. The way it illuminates the faces of the three people in the scene is really strong. It creates this high contrast, light to shadow ratio, and it's so dramatic. And it looks at first as if it was flash that illuminated these faces. But if you look at the people, they're all at different distances. So the light source has to be huge. In this case, I think it's the sun, because if it were just a speed light, you would see a drop off in terms of exposure as it moved from the far left to the far right. So the fact that all three of these people are evenly exposed, to my thinking, it's either the sun or a very large and strong light source. But I love the way the light plays off of each one of them, and I especially love the gesture of the woman in the front who's raising her hand up, I guess, to block the sun a little bit. So that's the initial quality of light that we perceive because of that contrast, and the way that the two figures in the left half of the frame are almost being lost into the shadow of the building behind them, while the woman in the lower right-hand corner, her head is outlined by the blue sky. Now, the other quality of light that's happening is just the way the sky is rendered in the background and how it serves as a perfect backdrop for this statue in the lower right-hand corner, which is rendered as a silhouette. And I'm just noticing something here. There is a fourth person all the way down here in the middle of the frame. It's really hard to perceive. So even though I don't have any exif info here, this must be with a wide-angle lens. That's amazing. I mean, I'm just picking up on it right now. Can I magnify this a little more? Yeah, that is definitely a face there. So maybe this was shot with a wide-angle lens just because of the inherent depth of field that it has there, and just because of how small that person in the distance is rendered. It's really even more interesting photograph than I thought before. But let's get back to the lighting. So here you have these people who are side lit by the sunlight. And then we have this figure of the statue that is silhouetted, where the exposure behind the statue is much brighter than the figure itself. And by exposing for the highlight, by exposing for the brighter area of the frame, that subject is rendered as silhouette, and these subjects are rendered as sort of a high contrast rendering. And it's two different ways of using the light all in a single frame. And this is kind of what I'm suggesting to you is when you go out there, look at scenes and see whether or not you can play off of the different ways light is being rendered or played in different areas of the composition. Because this image, if this had just been a uniform black background, the shot would still be kind of interesting. It would really be reliant on this high contrast look. But having this area on the far right edge of the frame creates a much different dynamic. It doesn't become as static and as boring as having a uniform background. Having that silhouette there provides a great counterpoint to everything else that's happening in the frame. And it's a little more of a challenge to see in this way because we're kind of trained to always look for your subject and just place them in front of a simple and clean background. But if you can start challenging yourself to see with a little more depth and to pay attention to the different way light is rendered in any particular scene, I think you open yourself up to making much more complex and interesting compositions. Okay, here we have a shot by Alessio Grigolini. This was created with Olympus EM5 Mark II at 1/20th of a second at f1.8 ISO 100. So here we have people that look to be just outside of a bar. And then we have this light that's coming from the right hand of the frame, which is illuminating them. You can see how the light illuminates this woman's blonde hair, and this recedes to shadow, and you can see the light on the edge of his face, and even a slight glow from his phone onto his face. But then you see another person's silhouette, or shadow, more accurately, as it creates this outline of his profile against the wall. And you can see the contrast between the brighter area that's being illuminated by the sunlight or whatever artificial light existed here off to the right. You see this contrast between this, brighter area of sort of yellow, mustard yellow, and this darker area. And it creates a really nice definition for these people here, right? And I love the shadow there. And then we have this different part of the scene, the interior of the bar, where this fellow here, the bartender, is being illuminated by the artificial light sources within the bar. Because you can see that there's an overhead light that's hitting the top of his head. You have this decorative lighting that's illuminating all the liquor bottles in the background. We have some light coming in from the interior that you can see here, illuminating the floor and it's just the overall area. And it produces a really wonderful point-counterpoint. Not only is it just a good sort of storytelling image, but visually it's really interesting. Because even though the people aren't really doing something particularly dynamic, I mean, this guy is just on the right is just on his phone, and we all know how we feel about people on their phones and photographs. But it's the light that really makes this an interesting shot, because if the light here had been just completely uniform, you wouldn't have these elements of light and shadow and color that make this shot really, really interesting. And on top of that, this image is also about shape, not just the outline of this person's face and shoulder, but also the shape created by the transition from shadow to highlight. This shape of her purse, the shape of their heads, the broom here, this window, and these rectangles and squares, and and all these diagonal lines that are implied everywhere. It's if you take a step back and don't look at it as just a couple of people just hanging out in a space, and you look at it graphically, you realize this photograph is really rich visually. And again, this is about two different qualities and sources of light that are playing off of each other, making for an interesting shot. Usually when I'm shooting, I'm often looking for transitions between light and shadow. That's usually my first in, right? I'll look for that, and that will kind of lead me into a scene, and I can discover more things as I examine the scene a little more carefully, and I start assessing what I'm going to include and exclude from the frame. And this shot is just a wonderful playground with respect to that, because you not only have the two different light sources, but the resulting light and shadow and color create a bunch of complex and interesting shapes and lines and graphics that make for a wonderful shot. If something more dramatic had been happening, all the better, but I still think that even though the activity, the human activity in the shot isn't particularly especially exciting, I think graphically and color and line wise, it's a wonderful shot and a good example of good seeing. All right, here we have a shot by Ohad Aviv. This was created with a Leica Q at 500th of a second, f14, ISO 800. Now, this particular approach is something that I'm often trying to do in any kind of situation where there are tall buildings that create really strong shadows in the street, because I use it in two ways. One is I'll position myself where there's a bright area of sunlight to illuminate my subjects, but then I'll use the shadows to obscure details that I find distracting, right? So there might be a lot of busyness in this area of the street. And what I do is I'll bias the exposure for the highlight. Either I'll use in aperture priority exposure compensation and reduce the exposure by -1 stop or more, or I'll simply set the exposure manually biased for the highlight, knowing that that exposure is going to severely underexpose the shadows and turn them into almost completely black. Okay? Because the camera's matrix or multi-pattern metering is always going to attempt to give you a good overall exposure where it gives you good highlight and shadow detail. And for a shot like this, you really don't want that. You want to allow those shadows to block up so you can create this really vivid contrast. And when you do that, and especially when you have a scene where the shadow is playing on the street itself, you create these different areas of attention for highlight. We obviously have these women here who are moving through the street scene. And we have this light here that's creating the shadow of not only these two women, but other figures that are on the street that we don't see within the frame. The light is also illuminating this guy in the blue shirt and someone wearing some shoes here whose feet extend from the shadows into the highlight. And even further back, you see the shadow here blocks up some detail here, but then it reveals this area in the background where you see these other buildings in the distance, as well as the sky and the roof line. And then up here, just above this woman's head, the light is illuminating this area right here. And I'm not sure exactly what that is. I want to say it's teddy bears or some sort of stuffed animal, but it's really hard to discern. But in any case, it's illuminating something there on that corner of the frame. So you can see that This is all the same sunlight, right? But because of how the shadows are present in the frame, it shapes the way that you navigate through the scene. Because you are obviously drawn to them and you move through here and you create this nice sort of circular pattern throughout the frame that's largely created by the contrast between light and shadow. But this concept of just looking for a street where the light is coming down, where it creates these shadows, is something to take advantage of, because you can compose your shot even before someone comes into the scene. You can sort of figure it out. You don't have to just rely on fast reflexes in order to make the shot happen. You can observe people coming up and down the street, figure out what your position is, figure out your overall composition, and then just wait it out as people come and walk through the scene. And one of the great things about it is, because you're standing there and then people see you with your camera and they see you already sort of framing and making a picture, they don't think you're making a picture of them, especially in this case because he's using a 28 millimeter lens. So you can include someone in the very far edges of your frame and they'll think that, oh, you're focusing on something past them. They don't get the concept that with a 28 or a 24 millimeter lens, you can include them in the frame, which is one of the reasons I really like using a wide angle for street photography. But by just paying attention to what's happening with light and shadow, even before you discover your subject, quote unquote, you can start building the composition and then just sort of wait it out. And what's remarkable here is that you get these two women. You get the gesture of both of their hands in the frame, great expressions on them. And then you get these two figures in the back, the guy with the blue shirt, the guy with the shoes. I mean, that's wonderful because I love the shadow play here, but having this guy here really adds a wonderful element to the shot. And you can see how by just slowing down and really observing what light is doing, not just with your subject, but with everything else that's in the scene, that's in front of you, you can all of a sudden elevate your compositions to a whole new level of seeing and composing and making photographs. All right, I hope you found that helpful. The Candid Frame is actually a podcast in which I feature conversations with photographers about their work and careers. And I've been doing it for about 12 and a half years. And I think if you've never heard of it and you've never heard the podcast, you definitely should check it out, especially if you have a passion for photography. The most recent conversation I had was with film director Sasha Waters Fryer. And she's not actually a photographer, but a film director, a documentary film director. And she did a documentary on the legendary street photographer Garry Winogrand. And it's going to be airing next year on 2019 on PBS's American Masters, and it's making the film circuit, the film festival circuit right now. So if you go to the site, when you go to my site, you'll see a link to where you can find out more about the film. But it's really a fascinating conversation of a photographer who died back in 1984 and who I would have loved to have had on the show. But this documentary provides some really great insight into not only the photographs but the story about the man behind the camera. So if you want to get a taste of what the documentary is going to be like, you should definitely check it out. And you can go to thecandidframe.com to find out more. And if you like what you're seeing here, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and see you next time.